Hi, everyone. I'm Vincent Atchity, Director of the Equitas Project and President and CEO of Mental Health Colorado. The Equitas Project is our national initiative to disentangle mental health and criminal justice. Thank you so much for joining our virtual conference series on mental health, excessive sentencing, and the death penalty. We're going to be offering 60-minute panels each day for 5 days, 2 of them today, to explore the intersection of mental health, excessive sentencing, and the death penalty. We'll cover a wide variety of topics, and I'm not going to go through each of the panel titles. All of that is available on our website. I just wanted to say, among the nations of the world that Americans generally hold to be our peer nations, the US, as you all know, is unique in its persistent use of excessive sentencing and the death penalty. We hope that as you join us for each of the panels that we've assembled, you'll consider the 360-degree impact of our nation's attachment to torturous or nearly torturous punishment inequitably administered on the mental health of everyone involved, not just the individuals facing excessive sentencing, but also the jurors, corrections officers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, mental health providers, advocates for social change, political actors, taxpayers, and all our children who so fervently want to believe and trust that ours is a just and humane nation. None of us who have our eyes open to the status quo of our system can experience the well-being to which we should aspire. Before we get started, I want to thank especially Sarah McGee from TASME and Stephanie Fauché from the Eighth Amendment Project, who've been key partners in making this week's events come together. Without them, this would not have come together so handily or with such a fantastic array of panelists. I also want to thank Emma Troten and Adam Goss from the Equitas Project, and also want to acknowledge the very generous support for the Equitas Project from the David and Laura Mirage Foundation. All our advocacy work is possible thanks to the generosity of partners and allies who care deeply about getting things into a better place when it comes to mental health and criminal justice. Thank you all for your donations. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first session, which is how racism impacts mental health, access to services and care, and criminal sentencing. Our panelists will be Dr. Sarah Vinson, author of Social Injustice and Mental Health, Danielle Serid from Common Justice, Dr. April Alexander. Hi, Dr. Alexander, nice to see you. From the University of Denver's Graduate School of Professional Psychology and FIRST program. And moderating today is Henderson Hill from the ACLU Capital Punishment Project. Thank you all for being with us. I'm going to go off screen, and Henderson, it's all yours.
Very good. Thank you, Vincent. Well, I'm happy and proud to kick off this wonderful series of presentations this week on one of the most important topics in the area of criminal justice, and that is, of course, how racism impacts mental health access to services and care, how that impacts excessive sentences, and most particularly the death penalty. I am a senior staff attorney at the ACLU project, the Capital Punishment Project of the ACLU. I'm especially proud of being a long-term partner with so many of our partners, EJUSA, the Eighth Amendment Project, Catholic Mobilizing. These are friends indeed. These are important stakeholders in this important conversation. And what a tremendous panel we have today. Let me just share a word about each of the panelists. Their resumes and biographies are impressive. It would take quite a while to go through them. I'm just going to give not even the highlights, but those things that jump out at me. First, let me introduce my good friend and colleague, Danielle Serid. I know Danielle for almost too long to admit, at least for her to admit. But she is the founder and the director of Common Justice. More importantly, she's a visionary in the work that that deals with that intersection of offenders and those harmed parties, the victims. She is so conversant on the issues of racial disparities that start long before arrests and convictions. And it's in that intersection that we're going to be spending some time today, just how far back these disparities arise. The awards for Danielle, again, would delay us too long. Only understand that her contributions have been appreciated, never more so than in North Carolina, where I hail from. We're anxious to have her come back and to have her hands involved on the projects that we're doing here. Welcome and thank you, Danielle, for your participation here. I'm introducing and meeting for the first time Dr. April Alexander, and what a thrill it has been to look at the work that she has done, the research that she's involved in. She hails from the University of Denver. And just to share some of what she does at the university, she serves as director of the Forensic Institute of Research, Service, and Training, outpatient competency restoration program that provides outpatient competency education and restoration for low-risk court-ordered adult defendants and juveniles. I think importantly, not only does Dr. Alexander think about these important issues, but she's hands-on on all of this, and most especially where it comes to issues of juvenile justice, gender mistreatment, cultural competency. These are all insights that Dr. Alexander has received a good bit of well-deserved attention and awards in celebration for her research and her work. Thank you, Dr. Alexander, for joining us.
Thank you.
Our third panelist will be joining us momentarily. As is true with all of us, she is busily engaged in this good work, and that good work is keeping Dr. Sarah Vinson just a little bit longer than her schedule had allowed for. But what a contribution she makes. She is triple board certified. My goodness, I don't know how one becomes triple board certified, but there she is. She specializes in adult, child and adolescents, and forensic psychiatry. I think importantly, from my perspective, she also directs an important part of this work at the Morehouse Medical School. And if I can say this word, I've been involved in this work for 40 years, and it is such a treasure to have three women with not only the vision, but the commitment to work with this endangered population, this threatened population. And Dr. Vinson does that in a spectacular fashion. But I think we'll have plenty to talk about with Danielle and with April, and we will anxiously await Dr. Vinson joining us. Danielle, just to get into the meat of it, I'm going to start with you. And the first question I would pose to you is asking you to describe it, give us an understanding of what barriers the Black community, people of color, face when trying to access mental health services. And what's the consequence of these barriers?
So thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. Thank you all for having me in this really important space today. And I thought for a while about whether it was appropriate for me as a white person to answer this question. And the reason I think it is I think it's important to say directly that the barriers to Black people accessing mental health support are mostly generated by structural racism and by white supremacy. And so it means that I know many, I do not know all of them, and will defer to my other colleagues, but I know many of them all too well because of my familiarity with those structures. So there are a variety of cultural factors that arise out of white supremacy culture fundamentally. There is the long-standing criminalization and blame of Black people. Black men and Black women and Black trans folks are criminalized and blamed differently, but all there is a fundamental presumption that is as old as our nation that associates Blackness and criminality. That means that people are blamed for what they experience, for how they behave, for what they feel, and for what has been done to them. That means we don't build supports for them. It means when they access those supports, they are met differently within them. And it means the culture in general treats Black people as though their pain is their own fault and their own business, and not the business of not just any white people, but anyone else necessarily to care for. There is a deep mythology that Black people do not experience pain in the same way. So there's an enormous amount of research on pain management in the medical field that find that when Black and white people report to the same levels of pain, white people are given far more, like, both acknowledgement and medication to deal with that pain, even when people are asked to give numerical accounting. When they say, how much do you hurt on a scale of 1 to 10? Two people saying the same number will be approached very differently. And that notion extends to how we think about people's mental pain and anguish as well. There is a vast normalization of violence, and particularly a normalization of violence against Black people in our culture. That begins with slavery, where that violence is institutionalized and profited upon, where it is committed by people who are regarded as the leaders and upstanding members of their communities. And that normalization has never been broken. And so we have long told a story that violence toward Black people and among Black people is inherent and is normal and is to be expected. And when things are normal, you are not expected to do anything about them or anything differently from that. And it forecloses other options of how people might otherwise be. One of the effects of that minimization is that, any of us, when we're hurt, turn to different coping strategies. And we turn to the coping strategies that are most aligned with our cultures, like the ones that make most sense to us. And it means one of the most common coping strategies for Black men in particular, because this intersects also with the ways in which male supremacy tells men that they don't hurt, they shouldn't hurt, they mustn't hurt, which is that very often the primary coping strategy Black men in particular deploys is minimization. They say it's no big deal, it's normal, it's fine, it doesn't matter, happens to everybody. That comes out of the larger cultural normalization, but that coping strategy is one that inherently makes it more difficult to access care, because you don't access care for something that you think is not a big deal, not important, not worthy of it. And that also shows up in the way in which one of the most primary symptoms that Black men in particular will experience, but that Black people who survive a great deal of harm experience, is numbness. And when numbness is your primary symptom, you're not as quick to seek help. And when you're asked, do you feel pain? Do you feel sadness? Do you feel hurt? And you answer no to all of it, everybody keeps it moving. When in fact, if somebody has lost someone to violence, if someone has experienced serious violence and serious harm and says they feel fine, it means something is wrong, right? And we would notice that and observe it differently. If, like, I, as a white lady, experienced sexual assault and said I was fine, people would assume that I was minimizing my pain, that my numbness wasn't healthy and had to be healed, as opposed to presuming that my pain was unreal or insignificant. And then I'll go fast through these, because we could talk all day. And then there are structural factors that exclude Black and brown people from accessing mental health support. Most of those existing support are mostly white-led, or mostly designed by white people, designed for people. Those that are vetted and validated have been mostly tested with white people. They are mostly administered by people with higher degrees that are more accessible to white people, so that the exclusion of Black and brown people from higher education manifests in the exclusion from professions that give this kind of care. That layers on to what is and isn't eligible for insurance. And so only certain kinds of care become eligible for insurance, and the other kinds of care that is culturally rooted, that is delivered by people without those precise credentials, become cost prohibitive even where they exist. Culturally rooted healing strategies are often judged or not even considered. They're not referred to, they're not well known, even though they have long existed, and they are the reasons that Black and brown people are still alive, despite centuries and centuries of enduring pain. So it is not that those strategies are not present. They are omnipresent, or we would not see anywhere near the level of, like, love and survival and everything else that we see, but they are certainly not covered by insurance. Yeah. The exclusion of those kinds of strategies exacerbates the stigma. that Black and Brown people experience, both about their original pain and about the ways they might seek to heal it. Funding tends to go to large white-led institutions at the expense of smaller grassroots organizations that are often more deeply situated in community and an existing relationship with people, so that when those people become hurt, those are the places they would go. Victims' compensation, which can fund people accessing therapy, requires that people report the police to be eligible and cooperate with law enforcement, which excludes any survivors who do not find that the police are likely to trust them to believe them or keep them safe. If you're in New York, sign our petition to change this law. The focus on medication that's often present in mainstream psychiatry can be a deterrent, especially in a context of a history of experimentation on Black people in the medical field. And these same larger barriers can show up with individual therapists who can minimize the pain of the people before them or fail to consider it, to understand it, to treat it, and to heal it. And of course, the consequences are grave. It means people are unwell, that they cannot thrive in the ways they otherwise would. It means people die. They themselves die. They kill others. Like, people are hurt, and that pain passes on through generations. People are dehumanized. And there's grave harm to our social fabric, where we live in the presence of needlessly unhealed pain and the deep loss of what people could otherwise contribute and what we as a community, as a world, could otherwise be. And I'll stop there.
I'd like to pick up on where you stopped. I mean, this notion that not seeing the pain, not recognizing the damage, not having the competence to intervene, and how that exasperates the situation for individuals, for families, for communities, and causes hurt. That's a powerful insight. And I guess we all in our cases see the implication of these failures. The case that I'm most recently working on involves a young man who was 20 at the time of the charge, at the time of the killing. Everyone in the room was under 25. One shot fired. No one even knew who the victim was. One shot fired, one young man, 18 killed. What is almost as tragic, one of the most tragic aspects of this is my client was in 8 different foster home placements, none of which recognized or intervened with the mental health needs of a still young man. And when you think about how things came to a head in that one mobile home, where immaturity and impulsivity reigned, how avoidable was that? So Dr. Alexander, this is what troubles me. Case after case after case, when I open up the file, you see these opportunities to avoid. And directing this connects up to a bigger picture. And I'd like to address that larger picture with you. What is traumatic racism? Can early childhood experiences of traumatic racism impact mental health later in life? What does that look like? In opening, we said this begins before arrest. Mm-hmm. It happens a lot sooner than that. Can you speak to those questions?
Well, you just spoke to a lot of what my research has been throughout my career. Is I've studied polyvictimization, the experience of different types of trauma throughout the lifespan, mostly focusing on children and adolescents. The children that I've worked with, or the adolescents that I've worked with in the legal system, by the time that they get to me at age 14, they've experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, neighborhood violence. Some have had their houses taken out in natural disasters. Trauma after trauma after trauma. One of the things that I've been reflecting on in recent years is we talk a lot about discrimination, but I don't think people see discrimination as its own form of trauma. That for a long time, people have talked about cultural or racial trauma, that these experiences of racial discrimination do explain why people of color tend to have higher rates of PTSD. That racial discrimination can induce distress, frustration, anxiety, have those adverse impacts on your physical health, like Danielle mentioned. So just thinking about you presenting to a doctor with physical health symptoms that might be in relation to trauma, but that not even being believed. And contributes to all of these things that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's talk avoidance, that maybe you don't want to go to work because you keep experiencing racial trauma over and over again by colleagues. In fact, there have been a few news articles in the last few months saying that they've done polls where Black women don't want to return to in-person work. We've been online for 2 years. I don't have to deal with the microaggressions at the water cooler anymore. I'm fine at home. So can we continue doing online work? Because actually my distress went down in some ways by not having to encounter those day-to-day interactions where you're going to be discriminated against. So back in the day, we might have called out of work because we just wanted to avoid. We might take more sick days because of the racial trauma that's occurred. So what I'm hoping is that we're naming racial trauma as a form of trauma, that we haven't historically done that before. And I've been talking to this with attorneys. Let's look at these kids that you've worked with and think about the experiences that they've had in their neighborhood environments, at their schools, because what we see is this racial trauma starts early. That there was a great article that came out back in 2020 that had African-American youth document the incidents of racial trauma or racial stress they've experienced on a day-to-day basis for a 14-day period. I see Danielle nodding her head. 14 days, list everything that you've experienced related to racial discrimination trauma. At the end of that 14 days, on average, these Black youth had experienced 70 different incidents of racial stress in 14 days. What were those? So people locking their car doors as you walked by, teachers treating you different as if you weren't smart, a peer pointing out that you fit a stereotype. So do that hip hop TikTok dance. Well, that doesn't seem bad. That is a form of discrimination and being isolated and pointed out, all the way to racial slurs being uttered at them in their school district. We saw here in Colorado, there was a school district where these kids dressed up in blackface and mimicked the George Floyd murder. So all of this starts early. And so when I'm talking to people about the experiences of Black youth, think about what that's doing to your self-concept, that you're having these different incidents that are happening over and over on a regular basis when you're forming your identity, trying to develop who you are, and all of that is marked by discrimination and trauma. So the world is already treating you in a certain way that you can't even get out of. We talk about this sense of wanting to have these like colorblind racial attitudes, but that's not realistic. We do see color. We see it every day. And these young kids are experiencing that via this racial discrimination, racial trauma. And these kids are going to turn into young adults who are going to turn to older adults who have been carrying this burden on them for so long. So for us, we need to name when that's happening. And I think in these last 2 years, as we're having discussions about what anti-racism looks like, decolonization, we need to look at that within our systems. So that could be mental health. So love all the studies that Danielle talked about earlier. Do you know that mental health practitioners are less likely to call you back if you have a ethnic sounding name? So if we're talking about barriers to care, we're further perpetuating some of this discrimination in our institutions and our systems. So this is where it has to stop, because it's affecting our young people, their well-being, and how the world's perceiving them and how they're perceiving the world.
You know, I had a powerful conversation last week with a Black woman in her 70s who spent 40 years or more as a school counselor. She went to segregated schools. You know, she talked about the powerful place that the principals of those Black schools played, that the teachers in those Black schools played. She spent 40 years as a guidance counselor. When integration came, she saw principals and assistant principals literally target young Black students, mostly boys, but young Black students, for expulsion and arrest for things that were not criminalized, were not signs of delinquency, that if any of them happened in the prior Black schools, The principal, the teachers there were legendary in their care and concern and restructuring of these students so that these are the kids that became leading members of the community. Fast forward after Brown versus Board of Education and integration, all of that was lost. And the schools became places of belligerence and hostility. Wow. Dr. Vincent, welcome. Glad to have you here. All of us are wondering how one becomes triple board certified. Fearing that that might take too long, we're going to delay your response to that question. And we will ask a more related question to this conversation. And that's a basic question. Are Black parents, are Black patients treated differently in the system? And I celebrate the presence of a Black psychiatrist and a Black psychologist on this panel. How rare an occurrence is that? And does that have an impact on the care that's provided?
Absolutely. So, I wish that I could tell you as a psychiatrist that the mental health system is an exception to all of the other systems that grapple with racism and with how that impacts the people that are in it and who are trying to receive services, but it is no better than any other system. I do a lot at the intersection of law and psychiatry and talk to a lot of judges and lawyers who have this fantasy that if we just get people into the mental health care system, everything will be fine. And my response to them is the mental health care system has a lot of work to do. And there's a reason that the mental health care system wasn't receptive and helpful and accessible to these people who end up in your courts in the first place. So the same issues with access, with inequity, with microaggressions, with macroaggressions occur in mental health as they do in the broader public. I think one of the things that we run into with mental health is that there's greater opportunity for subjectivity to sometimes make its way into diagnoses. And there's also this set of criteria that we use, the DSM, right, that's supposed to help guide our treatment decisions. And I see we have a question about race and discrimination and that being overlooked. And I would say it's actually not overlooked. It is systematically and intentionally ignored because it affects a group of people that the system does not value in the same way that they value upper middle class white people, who are the same people who are at the table when these criteria are being decided upon.
Yeah. This discussion, I think, is going to come back to you, Dr. Alexander. One of the individuals that we see is that many folks with severe mental illness never get treatment, never get diagnosis before they come to us, before they come to the legal system, and often under very serious circumstances, death penalty or other very serious violent circumstances. How do we change this? And can you explain what the term trauma-informed care means?
Well, we first need to eliminate these barriers to access. You constantly hear this disturbing kind of stat. They say Cook County Jail is the #1 mental health provider in the country. I'm pushing back against that because that should be inaccurate. So you're not actually getting real mental health prevention work in that facility. What they're saying is a majority of the people there at the Cook County Jail do have a history of mental health and substance abuse problems. My biggest question when I'm talking to people in community is, what if we got people access to treatment and care? What would that look like? Why is it that 90% of girls in the juvenile legal system have had a history of physical and sexual abuse? Why didn't we intervene earlier? Could we have gotten those girls care earlier? That's why I developed the program that I developed, is let's get these girls care. Let's facilitate some of their healing. And so I think my biggest question is, what are we doing as a system? Why aren't we getting people the access to care that they need? That I get calls from parents. What do I do with my child who is struggling with substance use? Where can I get them treatment? Because a lot of programs aren't there for youth. Some of them aren't using the best evidence-based or aren't culturally competent, as Dr. Vinson was kind of talking about a second ago. And so they're not catering to the needs of the public. And going back to that trauma piece, yes, most of the individuals in our facilities have experienced significant multiple forms of trauma, including those with severe and persistent mental illness. Trauma-informed care would be one, we have to acknowledge that trauma is existing first, and that it has an impact. Again, I'm not excusing criminal behaviors, but I want people to understand why they might have occurred. We criminalize adolescence, we criminalize poverty, and we're essentially criminalizing trauma. We're hearing trauma-informed care being used as a buzzword a lot. So I go to schools and they're saying, yeah, we're a trauma-informed school. And I challenge them and I said, no, you're not, because I just read in the paper that you handcuffed an 8-year-old and an 8-year-old with an intellectual disability.
Yeah.
So trauma-informed care would say, yeah, if I see this child in my classroom who's falling asleep, I'm not sending them to the principal's office. I'm not trying to get them suspended or expelled. I might ask, what's going on with them? During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a rise in some hotline calls, whether that was abuse hotline or suicide hotline calls in some areas during the pandemic. And now that our kids are back in their systems, their school systems with mandatory reporters, we're seeing another spike in experiences of abuse and maltreatment. Where is our care for those kids that we're going to keep penalizing them for their internalizing and externalizing behaviors while not reflecting on their trauma and how we can support them? And how do we support their agency, their autonomy, in order for them to thrive and grow? Where is our restorative or transformative justice in schools? So we can give them second chances. And so trauma-informed care is taking the lens of, no, trauma, we're not using it as an excuse to get out of your behavior or not hold you accountable, but it gives us a sense of empathy and understanding for the experiences that people went through, and hopefully connects them with systems that are caring and supportive and facilitative of their healing. I often hear, oh, that trauma is going to be with you for the rest of your life. I don't believe that. Healing can occur in a relationship, healing can occur in community, and recovery does occur. So let's get people the access to all of that to show them that this can happen.
Yeah. But what you said about Cook County being the largest healthcare or mental health provider in the state, that resonates in places like North Carolina as well. Yeah, Mecklenburg County, our sheriff, African-American, made a commitment while he ran in office to try to do better. And he set up he's supported a school system within the jail for 18-year-olds. He's operated first responders with training on mental health. But you realize maybe just a little bit too late, too little at the wrong place.
It's too late. Where we need to invest in is prevention.
Yeah.
Yes, we're doing some intervention work and our intervention is too late. We need to invest in prevention. We can prevent crime. We can prevent some of these social ills if we actually invest in it.
Problem comes from the immediate translation of mental illness with danger. If you're mentally ill, you are a dangerous person. First of all, is that true? And if not, how do we break out of that? Because what that does, it builds in a fear that I think prevents perhaps appropriate responses.
Yeah, and we see that people often fear what they don't understand, and that there's a way that stigma can compound, right? So if you are someone with a mental illness, there's a stigma that's attached to that. If you are someone with a criminal record, there is a stigma that is attached to that. And what you see in the public narrative often is that the two get conflated. But statistically, we know that people with serious mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime than to be people who are committing crime. And that a lot of the things that you see that lead to them being incarcerated are crimes of poverty, are crimes of systems that have failed them, that haven't given them safe places to live. So they get things like trespassing and loitering. And so it's one of those things where we see the tip of the iceberg, which is the individual's behavior. What we're not seeing is the way that all of these different societal systems failed them and put them in a position where they were on the street and you saw their symptoms rather than in a supported group home having those symptoms treated so that the symptoms wouldn't be visible, but they're also not out in public where the whole world can see and feel uncomfortable and then end up engaging the police around it.
Yeah, Danielle, never has this trafficking in fear been more prominent than with the discussion of predators, Black predators. And it's of one with this notion of Black dangerousness. Can you talk specifically about these myths that have led to so many Black people, and most especially Black men, receiving harsher sentences, harsher punishments, including the death penalty within our criminal legal system?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are not new myths. Like, these myths are as old as our nation, and as racist as our nation, right? They are formative of who we are. They are the stories that enabled people to enslave and subjugate and torture other human beings, and still ever sleep at night. Like, they are the stories that let people rip children from their parents, and go home to their own children and embrace them and not like collapse on the floor in shame, having done what they just did. They're the stories that let people commit like levels of torture that would be unbelievable, like, but for like the sheer prevalence that makes us have to sit and face the fact of what white people did to Black people in the founding of this country. And the stories, like, people can't do that to people who they consider fully human. They have to justify that behavior as somehow protective of themselves, of their precious white women wives who they can beat, but no one else, like all of those things, right? And we've never grappled with that history. We've never outgrown that history, right? That history has shifted shape over the years, as things do. So we go from slavery to convict leasing to mass incarceration, but without ever a moment's breath between those. It's like the great continuity of this nation is white supremacy and anti-Black racism, right? And there is not a way around it that I know of but through it, but the acknowledgement of it not as just a thing that happens now, but as a thing that has always defined us. There's not a way around it but through a reckoning with that present and the history in which it's rooted, through the intergenerational deprivation and the intergenerational pain, and Dr. Alexander's point, the intergenerational trauma that lives in our bodies, right? Like, there is all sorts of research that demonstrates the transmission of trauma. And you think about it the way, because like, we're animals. And so like, if an animal is eaten by another animal, it gets inscribed in its DNA so that its child knows to flee that animal when it sees it, right? It's how species survive. We pass down in our DNA the stories and lessons of our pain. And it is part of how our descendants live, but it also means that pain gets written into our blood, into our bones, like into our organs. And I share Dr. Alexander's sense that there is never a point at which healing isn't possible. The degree to which, how far back it can reach, right, is always a question, but it's not, when I say that, I think it's really important that it not signal some kind of like the notion that it's too much or too late, because I think sometimes we steer away from our reckoning for that reason. We believe like the harm white people have caused is so immense that there is no way to turn to it but to let every single thing and every single one burn. And most people don't want to make that choice. I believe that a reckoning is possible. I believe that repair is possible. I watch people repair interpersonal violence all the time, and I know our human capacity to reach for repair once truth telling has happened is vast, like almost unending. But I also know that a prerequisite for everyone being able to do that repair is the telling of that truth and the entirety of that truth. Slivers of truth don't get you to transformation. Full truths open doors to ways of being that couldn't otherwise be possible. And so the story of Black dangerousness has defined us. It is interwoven to Dr. Vincent's point and Dr. Alexander's point with the story of Black people's imperviousness to pain. That is some of how Black dangerousness is rendered, right? Like no matter how much pain is inflicted, that person will keep hurting you, right? Like that's the formative story. But in that is a story that Black people don't hurt in the same way. It's why not only do we kill Black people through the death penalty wildly disproportionately, but we also, if you look at the victims of crime, there's grave disproportionality too. People don't get the death penalty for killing Black people. I don't recommend that they do, but it's really important that we understand the death penalty as a punishment we inflict on Black people who hurt white people, almost exclusively, right? Like there are exceptions, but just the vast majority of that practice, that's what it is in a country that has enslaved people, in a country that has lynched people, in a country that has excluded people economically and socially in all of these ways to continually underscore that the violence of that exclusion from the social fabric and from the whole. And so I believe that we hear it anew, and that, you know, we have and it comes in different forms and different voices. And you could be in a major city, for instance, with a Black mayor and hear these same things ring loud, as some of us may happen to be. It doesn't mean that it doesn't shapeshift, but our ability to actually fundamentally question that story, to sit with that story in a way that is rooted in where it comes from, and to answer for our responsibility in generating it, I think is not only a prerequisite for things like equity and access to mental health care, as we're talking about. I think it's a prerequisite for the survival of any semblance of a democracy that we have ever aspired to be.
Yeah, I was reminded this week that the point that we can change, systems can change. We don't have to let these injustices stand. There was an op-ed last week in the New York Times about one example of excessive sentencing, a 14-year-old Black boy that was sentenced to 60 years in prison, based literally, explicitly on the theory of Black super predators. And to have that theory so soundly debunked, one could think that that young man and others would just sort of stay in that state. But fortunately in Connecticut, the Connecticut Supreme Court recognized the travesty of that situation and corrected it. There are efforts afoot to have review of those outrageous and extreme sentences. And you know, I think it's incumbent on us who know that the systems, both at arrest and long before arrest, that encourage these disparities can and must be changed. Dr. Vincent, what must we do differently in terms of helping people with mental illness stay out of the carceral system? You know, the description of the Cook County Jail as the biggest provider in Illinois, or the Mecklenburg County Jail, the biggest provider in Mecklenburg County. Can you talk about or address some of the policy changes, some of the solutions that could start undoing this backwards way of treating mental illness, folks with mental illness?
Absolutely. So to echo one of Dr. Alexander's points earlier, this is really about prevention, right? There's all this talk about crisis and the children's mental health crisis and people being in mental health crisis. And we can build all the hospitals we want. The question is, why are so many people in our society, given all the resources our society has, in crisis in the first place? How is it that we are configured that is setting such a large population up to have these mental health issues? And it comes down to, we haven't made decisions that protect children, that stabilize families, that make sure people have basic things they need for healthy growth and development. And what we see as the result of those decisions is this huge mental health burden in our communities, and we're only seeing it go up. And so, yes, we need more treatment. Yes, we need more access to treatment. What we have to really understand is that there is mental health in all policy. There's mental health in food policy, in housing policy, in educational policy. And until we decide that all of the kids in our country deserve those basic necessities and that all of the kids in our country have potential and are worth investing in, we're going to continue to see these large swaths of our population that have these problems.
Professor Alexander, I started early in the conversation, noted my struggle currently with a client who had 8 different foster placements. A former classmate of mine, Dorothy Roberts, has written a book called Torn Apart, which really takes a challenge to our foster care system and what it does to the Black community in particular. You know, whether it's that system or others, are there specific either institutions or systems or ways of treating folks of color, most especially Black children? Are there solutions that can be attempted to intervene, particularly with the young, to avoid this, this almost direct pipeline into our carceral system?
Yeah, it's a challenge. And this is where we have to get involved in dismantling some of these systems. I named the school to prison pipeline earlier, but a lot of activists and scholars have been naming other types of pipelines. So you just mentioned the foster care to prison or the cradle to prison for the lack of prenatal care and postnatal care that we're giving birthing individuals. All of this starts with thinking about probably our social determinants of health. Thinking about the things that create or reduce our disparities in our health and mental health systems and reduce things like crime. So let's examine our food deserts or housing insecurity that are happening in our communities. What if we get people access to those resources? For our kids, looking at them from, I've been speaking a lot lately on a positive youth development model. I don't say at-risk kids anymore, and this is what I learned from other activists. Let's change our notion to at promise, because all of these youth have promise and potential. Our Black youth have promise and potential. Are we giving them the resources they need in order to succeed? Are we giving them resources in their education system? What does their neighborhood look like? Do they have access to aftercare programming that's free or affordable that would keep them maybe off the streets and possibly getting into trouble? Where are we providing all these, again, preventative supports to help families? This is where we've been having conversations, particularly over the last 2 years, about looking at our city and state budgets. Let's examine how we're not supporting social safety nets in so many places. And so what if we gave our children those opportunities to thrive? I like when I see those models of what if every kid played an instrument? What if every kid had some sports education? What if every kid had a mentor starting at an early age? If you have a Black teacher in K through 3rd education, your likelihood of going up to college increases 13%. If you have 2, it goes up over 26%. So we have all of these things that we could be investing in that we're just not at this moment. Our Black kids can thrive, they can be successful, they are successful. Let's give them the tools in order to do so.
Danielle, I'd like to ask you to sort of continue that conversation that Dr. Alexander just started. I know that in North Carolina, you testified in a way that was very helpful to a group that was thinking about, restorative justice issues. And it was stunning, the number of people that thought of victims entirely as white and mostly white females, and just failure to put the face on folks of color as traumatized people, as people who suffer from PTSD, as people who should be entitled to interventions, governmental interventions. How do we do better from a systems point of view, policy point of view? How do we reverse these long ingrained approaches?
So I agree very deeply with Drs. Alexander and Vincent that there's, a massive investment in prevention is important, and understanding prevention also as the elimination of structural inequities, right? That prevention is about access to safe housing and access to good food and access to Dr. Alexander's point, good education with the right teachers, right? That those things are all, it's not just kind of early classes about anti-violence, right? It's all these things that we would want, any of us would want for our own children, to trust that they would be safe and could thrive and could become the people we wanted them to be, and in meeting everybody's basic needs. But in terms of healing supports, it's also, I think it really matters to say, like, these exist and they always have. Like, Black and brown people would not still be here today were it not for all of these informal healing systems that are present. They are underfunded. They are often disconnected from one another. They are what we in the organizing world call disorganized, meaning like intentionally structurally kept separate from one another so that their power can't concentrate into an otherwise organized mass and demand more. So some of what we do is like resource those things. And those are small clinics, but those are also neighbors. Those are people who everyone goes to when someone's shot, who they know because they have been through it themselves. They've helped others through it. Like, it is all those kinds of caretakers. We remove barriers to victims' compensation. We do not require that people report to the police in order to access care when they're hurt. We recognize that certain people will legitimately have greater fear of the police and less expectation that the police will believe them, will treat them decently, will act on the case that they bring to them, and will not put them in greater danger. And we don't compound that harm by excluding those very same people from accessing the compensation that could pay for the care they need and deserve for the harm they suffered. We expand access points in people's communities where they live, like through the people they already know and already trust, instead of asking them to start an intake process in a neighborhood far from their own in a large white-led institution, even if maybe if they're lucky at the tail end of that, they find their way to the one Black therapist on staff. We support non-linear healing processes. We expect that people will engage and disengage and engage, and we don't talk about them being like bad patients or bad at care or having dropped out or all of those other things. We referred someone to a major like victim service provider once who told us they couldn't, after his intake, that they couldn't see him because he was still in the circumstances that put him at risk initially, and that made like trauma healing inappropriate and unsafe. And I was like, those circumstances are like being Black in America, like that's not going to change for him in his lifetime. We had a young participant who we referred to a therapist after he was shot 6 times, and the video of it went viral. So it was also, there was all sorts of public conversation and shame and pressure on him to retaliate and all sorts of things, in addition to a near-death experience. And the therapist asked him how he felt about the shooting. He said, fine. But on the intake, he had answered that he occasionally smoked weed, and she spent 8 sessions talking to him about his weed use. And so we also like regard that as malpractice, right? We hold, so it's not, it is partly about lifting up the right therapists who are not going to behave in that way, but it's also understanding that that is as damaging as a medical doctor misdiagnosing something or removing the wrong organ in a surgery. Like, it is harm that people are doing, and were people accountable for it, they would be likelier to learn or to be removed from the profession. But we're mostly not creating from scratch. Like, there are enormous, there are wide-ranging, long-standing, intergenerational, ancestral, informal, and formal healing modalities everywhere. And a lot of what I believe we have to do is remove the barriers. Like, I think about if we were to ask, like, why are so many people in the shadows? Like, what the way we currently do is like, the way you would look at it is everyone would just keep looking closely at the person and asking, like, what's wrong with you that you're so shadowed? If you really want to see why people are in the shadows, you look at what is between them and the light, right? And so you look at like, what are the structural barriers that are between Black and brown people and the light? And how do we remove those barriers instead of trying to somehow examine them and interrogate them, like to ask them why the sun's not shining brighter in their eyes. And I'll stop there.
Well, don't stop there. Keep these conversations going, particularly with your new mayor, as we hear that there's going to be a pickup in littering arrests and fare evasions and urinating in public. You know, what that threatens, it can be scary. So I'm not sure who's listening to who in New York. There's a lot of loud conversations going on. But please keep talking, Danielle. Keep that voice going forward. Now, Dr. Vincent, maybe one reason you got 3 board certifications is you're able to multitask. And I believe you were reading the chat and you picked up some questions from the chat. Are there other questions in the chat? I know that we have just a few moments to go, but I can't multitask. So I can't read the chat and get questions. But are there questions any of the panelists see in the chat that we can respond to?
Dr. Alexander and I did some written responses, so I think we're
Oh, okay. So look at that. Yeah, there must be a 4th certification you guys are ready for. Well, that's so impressive. I mean, I think this conversation is so very important. I know that whether you're in Durham, North Carolina, or in the Bronx, these are conversations that not enough people are having. And, I think the willingness to do something about what by now, unless you're on the proponent side of critical race theory demagoguing, there really is a sense of the ultimate truth of what we've been talking about and how this truth impacts the extraordinary racial disparities at all level of our legal system. And that starts from literally from birth and the months and the years that follow from that. So this has been an incredibly important conversation. I think we've got just a couple of moments if there are other reflections that any of the panelists want to share on these topics that we have not touched on, or resources that you would point our audience to. Please do.
I would just like to add quickly that opposition is part of the process and it's to be expected. We've never had to say, let's pass a law against critical race theory in schools because we all understood it was never going to be taught in the first place. The only reason there's opposition now is because there's a real threat of it happening. So don't get discouraged by those things, understand them as a mark of our progress.
That's absolutely true. I'm working with a community in a very small rural town in North Carolina, where this is being used in a very visceral sense, intimidate teachers, intimidate educators and school systems. And yes, it's a historical thing, but it comes with particularized pain and fear. I mean, it is stirring up fear in different quarters that folks have not felt in decades. So this is a vulnerable time. But thank you all 3 for the light that you bring to this conversation. Super important. And if we can keep up this standard for the rest of the week, wow, our community will be surely enlightened. Thanks for kicking us off to a very good start.
Thank you so much, Henderson and panelists. It's been great to have you with us. We're going to take a minute and get started with the second session of the series at about 1 minute after the hour. Hope you can all remain with us.